Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Prince George's County Memorial Library System's virtual programs. My name is Nick Brown. I'm the COO for Communication and Outreach. I'm going to do a longer intro, but just right off the bat, would love to introduce to you our distinguished guest, George M. Johnson, who is the author of All Boys Aren't Blue. Welcome to you. We're really grateful to have you with us tonight. Also, welcome to my wonderful colleague, Hawa Jallo, who is a library staff member here in Prince George's County. Welcome, Hawa.
Thank you.
We are so excited to be with all of you tonight, both to commemorate Pride Month, which started as a riot for anyone who didn't register that when you learned about Pride Month. And tonight we are really thrilled and honored to be partnering with some of our wonderful colleagues throughout the state of Maryland on co-presenting this event. We're co-presenting with the Arundel County Public Library System, also the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, the Calvert County Library, the Howard County Library, and also the Carroll County Public Library. This is a great team effort here in Maryland, and we're so grateful to all of you for joining us tonight from across the state, and also those of you who are tuning in from DC, though we do not envy your lack of representation in Congress. Even though Delegate Eleanor Holmes-Norton is fabulous, we enjoy our votes in Congress over here, and we hope to vote in support of your statehood soon. I know that the House of Representatives is taking up a vote next week, which is super awesome. So tonight's program is part of a series here at Prince George's County Memorial Library System to commemorate Pride Month. We call it Pride at PGCMLS. We are super thrilled to have George with us because his book is one of the hottest things in the literary world right now, and it deserves to be at that stature because he and his story are representative of an amazing community of Black queer youth in this country, and his book is a YA memoir collection of essays. And we are just thrilled for the opportunity to have him share his work with all of you tonight. The format today is we're going to have an interview between the three of us for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to switch over to Q&A, where all of you will have the opportunity to ask questions or share comments. Before we get into anything further, I want to remind everyone that we are broadcasting on multiple platforms. If you have any trouble with the sound or video here in Crowdcast, we encourage you to check out the PGCMLS YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook feeds. And we also have captions available on Facebook and YouTube, so you can tune in there if you would like to access closed captions. If you have not borrowed the book from your local public library yet as an ebook and audiobook, you should do that. Get on the hold list. If you would like to read it sooner because it is in high demand, we encourage that you buy a copy of All Boys Aren't Blue from either Loyalty Books, which is a Black and queer-owned bookstore here in Maryland and in DC, or Mahogany Books, which is a Black-owned bookstore in DC. And if those aren't available to you, then check out East City Bookshop, which is on Capitol Hill, and it's all women-owned. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Hawa, who is going to kick us off, and thanks for tuning in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hawa. I'm a library associate for the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. You can find me at the Glenarden branch once we eventually reopen. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our author here today. So George M. Johnson is a writer and activist based in New York. He has written on race, gender, sex, and culture for Essence, The Advocate, BuzzFeed News, Teen Vogue, and more than 40 other national publications. He has appeared on BuzzFeed's AM to DM as well as on MSNBC. All Boys Aren't Blue is his debut.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, we're just going to dive in, George, because we've got so many questions. I'm going to kick things off with a short reading with your permission, if that's okay. So your book is just like, there are so many layers of meaning and importance to your work, and we really appreciate all that you've done to be vulnerable and sharing this story with us. Those of us who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, our own journeys are very unique to our experiences, though they tie into the themes that larger communities deal with. But putting this to page is a real statement and courage of your being willing to share this with everyone to help pave a path for folks who need this example. So we're grateful to you for that. So I'd like to share a little paragraph from the afterword, and it goes something like this, and I quote, "There were no books for me to read in order to understand what I was going through as a kid. There were no heroes or icons to look up to and emulate. There were no roadmaps or guidelines for the journey. And again, because I know there wasn't and still isn't much out there, I made it my original goal to get this right." I was on the verge of tears throughout this entire book. I can't personally identify with all of the experiences that you had. There were some intersections in my own experience with coming out and being in a very Catholic Hispanic family. at Mixed Race Family. Can you tell us a bit about why this book is important and why you even undertook this effort?
Yeah, I mean, it's like short answer is it's important because we didn't have anything. Like there wasn't a lot that existed, or if it did exist, it existed in like a fictional space. It didn't like you weren't able to connect directly with a person who had said experiences that you may have been going through. And so the book gives you me, right? It doesn't just give you my story, but it also gives you me, the person that is still here, able to interpret those stories and able to expound upon those stories once you're reading them and trying to process them. The long answer is, there's just always been like this thing for like young Black kids, just in general, where, like we're born into oppression. And so like these systems are already happening prior to us even knowing what a system of oppression is. And so oftentimes we're first introduced to those traumas because we go through them. Like we have to go through it to actually understand what racism is, right? It's like in kindergarten, all of the kids get along until the white boy says something to the Black boy, and the Black boy has to go home and ask their parents about it. And then that's their first point of when they can remember racism, right? And like people can always ask the question to us like, oh, well, when do you remember your first time you dealt with racism, your first time you dealt with sexual assault, your first time you dealt, and for Black kids in particular, like we always can pinpoint it, but we never have like a roadmap or a blueprint. And so for me, the book was important because I knew that me being nearly 35 years old and still not feeling like I see myself on TV represented in as much as I should be, still feeling like I don't see myself represented in journalism as much as I should be, it automatically let me know that I had to enter this space and give a child something that I wish I had myself. Give a parent something I wish my parents were able to have and my aunts were able to have, to understand some of the things that I was going through and trying to process as a child, processing adult things with the mind of a child. And so that is how I came to the conclusion that like I was going to really write this story, but focus it on young adults, because I feel like that's the age demographic where most of the decisions that you make as an adult come from, right? It's like things that you do at age 35 is because your mom scolded you at one time when you were 10 and you just never realized that you just kept doing the same thing because of this one time you were scolded. And so it's like, if I can get a book into people's hands that help them to understand Black queer children's existence, how we have to navigate and how all of these systems intersect, then that means that by the time they start to formulate their opinions as young adults, they'll be formulating them with the actual education and information that they need.
Awesome. And just would like to give thank you for sharing that. And shout out to Mary from your team at Macmillan Publishers. On behalf of libraries everywhere, thank you to Macmillan for publishing Georgia's story and stories like this. The publishing industry has a huge way to go in terms of improving representation. But in the last few years, we have seen a tremendous shift, and especially in the young adult category, where the stories that would have made a difference for generations of people are now being told in print, which is a huge, huge deal. And there will need to be more of this going forward. But we appreciate what they're doing for all of us in this country in terms of the publishing. Cool. So Hawa, you're up.
So the book starts off really powerful with you telling the story of how you got your front teeth kicked out when you were 5. So what made you decide to start the book off with that event?
I felt it was important for me to start the book off because like, I don't have like, it's like when you try and go back to like, well, what's your first actual memory?
Right.
Is that like a actual memory, or is that like something that I created in my imagination to think that was my first memory, right? So it's like, I don't know if I can remember anything from when I was 2 or from when I was 3, but I do know specifically I can remember very vividly this fight till this day. Like because I only live 30 minutes from home, like I can go to the corner where this fight happened and I can remember how it happened and I can remember where everyone was and where the house was. And so because that technically in my mind, I kind of think that's like my first memory in a sense. because it's my oldest one that I actually can fully see the best. And so I felt it was important to start there because we often don't realize, like, when we're introduced to a trauma that carries out for a very long time. And so there are pictures of me where I smiled sometimes growing up, but I did not smile a lot. And one of the things that I get oftentimes when people look through my Instagram or look through a lot of just photos of me, like, I'll get people who DM me like, oh, you should smile more. And for years, I'd never told, like, why it bothered me to smile and why, like, my teeth were such like a Achilles heel for me that I just never really wanted to talk about or never really wanted to deal with. And so I thought it was really, really important because, you know, other people loved my smile, but I couldn't appreciate it. And so, you know, if you read that story, it connects to a moment when my mom was about to go into brain surgery and she told me to smile. And I did. And it did make me feel better, smiling through like tears in a sense. But again, it was just like one of those things that I felt was taken from me at a very young age. And then I just didn't have the words or the control to like figure out how I could fix that thing. And so I wanted to start off with that story too, because I think it's important that people, parents, guardians start to understand that, like, when kids go through something, like, you kind of have to, we all have to learn how to unpack it with a child. Like, okay, well, how do you feel? Like, talking to them the next day, talking to them a week later, talking to them 2 weeks later. Why it's so important that sometimes kids do need to go to therapy after, let's say, they get jumped or after something happens, because we're just so used to like, okay, you got jumped yesterday, it's all right, you know, toughen up, go back to school. And it's like, sometimes you carry that forever and you never unpack it. And so I thought it was important to start there. And now, as I said, like, I just got braces for the first time and I'm almost 35, but like, I now have the money to fix a trauma, in a sense, that I've had for a very long time. And so, like, getting, like, in the dentist's office, I cried multiple times over the past 4 months as I was getting all of this dental work done to correct it, because it was connected to something that I always wanted to, I feel like, fix about myself, and fix for the little boy, you know, that really was scarred from that moment.
I like that in the chapter you mentioned Cardi B, how she got a bag and fixed her teeth.
Yeah. And again, I think it's because, like, when you listen to music, you listen to people like Cardi B, you listen to Mary J. Blige, like, you listen to music because they usually sing through their trauma, or they rap through their trauma, or they tell you their story. But I can only imagine, like, how many times was Cardi B criticized for her teeth online, in school. And again, it's like, for her to rap about that, it lets you know that was something that really, really was a traumatic thing for her, that she really wanted to get fixed as soon as she was able to do it herself. And so I thought it was important because, like, we just think it's a lyric in a song, but realistically, that's somebody's truth and somebody's pain sometimes, and we're still not hearing it. And then, like, so I wanted people to hear it and to see it and to recognize when it's happening and be able to fix it or help someone fix it.
For the folks who haven't read your book yet, would you mind giving a little synopsis of the incident that this describes?
Yeah. So when I was 5 years old, we were walking home from school, and it was me, my cousin Raul, my cousin Russell. I was about 5, they were about 9 and 10. And while we were walking home from school, we got jumped by a group of kids that they had some prior beef with, like, earlier that day in school. Or whatever, but I was only 5, and so, like, these kids were all around their age. So instead of them just, like, leaving me alone and fighting my cousins, they also attacked me in that moment. And basically, 2 of them held me down while one kicked me in the mouth a few times and kicked out my teeth. And so, yeah, so that was the incident that happened. And, you know, it's interesting because from that, like, my Uncle Raul, who I do talk about in the book, he taught me how to fight. After that, like, once I was old enough to really learn how to fight, he taught me how to fight and really have to, like, protect myself. My cousins always protected me. I mean, in that moment, they were protecting me, but, like, even harder, there are other times where they really, really protected me, which I'll talk about in the future. But, yeah. But yeah, so that's what that incident was that we're referencing right now.
Yeah. One of the things that was so beautiful about this story, even though there are a lot of highs and lows in terms of the experience, is the way that your family just enveloped you with love and support, even though there were differences in how that was visible, from your cousins to your parents to your grandmother. Can you speak a bit about what your family was like growing up and how they're there for you now, even as you've gotten older?
Yeah, my family, my family means the world to me. And so, growing up, we were very big on family. We were very big on Christmases. We were very big on Thanksgivings. We had a very big family, so to speak. And so I had great relationships with, and I think it's so interesting because clearly, like, my grandmother is like the focal point of the story, in a sense, of the nurturing and everything. But it wasn't because like my mom wasn't there or my dad wasn't there or my aunts and uncles weren't there. It was just that back then, like, your parents worked. So like my mom worked 2 jobs, my dad worked 1 job, which was as a police officer, which had, extremely long hours and everything. And so we primarily were at my grandmother's house, and we primarily were raised by my grandmother. And we all went on vacations every year, 4 boys, with my grandmother. And so she just always was like the nurturer, but she was the nurturer and the matriarch for everyone. And so the relationships I got to build with like my aunts and everything were very, very like cool. It wasn't like aunt, nephew. And even with my grandmother, it wasn't like grandmother, grandson, as much as it was like, she was our friend. Like she could wrestle with us. She would play cards with us. She would cook with us. She would talk mess to us. Like she was a cool person. And all my family members were like cool people. So of course they were our authority, in many, many ways, but they also were our friends in many, many ways. And so now as an adult, like the relationship that I have with them is not just like I'm their nephew or that's my nephew. It's like they're my friends, and like we can talk and we can drink together and we can party together and we hang out together, and they meet my friends and they can come with me, my friends. I know all their friends. It's we operate from a place of love. And like our family has always just operated from a space of love. Like even after fallouts, even after fights, even after everything else, like we always try to start at least from love, and then we kind of figure everything out after that. And I think that's what's been so fortunate for me and the queer people in my family, because I'm not the only queer person in my family, is that our family has always started out with loving us first and then kind of figuring out the rest later. I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah. And it's really powerful to hear you describe all of that. And I know, like, from your experience, is probably you're luckier than a lot of other people in the LGBTQ community. And I know I was very lucky with my family being supportive, even though there was a lot of tough love and a lot of like confusion and reaction to things. But at the end of the day, my family, I come from a Catholic background. There's a learning curve, and we've accomplished that curve, which is a big deal. And I'm so proud of everyone, and everyone's kind of ability to stay rooted in the love first, even when there's the tension, has been really essential. And there are a lot of folks out there who do not have that privilege with their family environment. And it's really important for all of us who have been lucky with our families to acknowledge that privilege and then continue to shed light on the folks who need our support, and to hear about our experiences too.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite chapters is the chapters when you talk about your college experience. So in the book, you discuss how becoming a member of Alpha Phi Alpha helped you to define your masculinity. Were you ever apprehensive about pursuing membership?
It's interesting. Like I don't think I got nervous about pursuing membership until I already had started. Like I guess I maybe I didn't fully recognize like how I potentially could be coming off to like this this room of masculine people with so much, being so effeminate being as effeminate as I was. But I never really like thought about that. But I knew why I wanted to join the org, because I knew like I had this issue like where I felt like, in addition to wanting brotherhood, in addition to like wanting to finally create like my own friend circles, and in addition to like wanting to feel like a part of some type of group or some type of community, I was chasing masculinity, and fraternities in my mind kind of gave you that cred of like of a masculine thing. Of course, once I got in, I learned that was much different, and like the things that I was running away from were the things that I kind of ran directly into by joining a fraternity. which in a sense was really, really amazing and great because I have great relationships now with all of my line brothers still. We talk almost every day, certain ones of us. But yeah, again, like the frat is just very, very interesting because like I still am very active in many ways. And again, like the thing that I was thinking I was trying to gain from it, I gained the things I needed from it, not the things that I wanted from it. I guess that's the best way to put it. Like I have one important thing, but I actually gained the thing I really needed from the community. And so like for that, I'm forever grateful. But I definitely didn't go into it like thinking like, oh, they're not gonna pick me, or like I don't know. I just knew I was gonna get picked. I don't know. I don't know. I just had like this feeling. And again, my line brothers will tell you that too. Like my experience was a little bit different because I did kind of just get like picked. Like one of the people who ran the chapter I was friends with, and he just was like, oh, like he's like one of this like this really, really smart kid here. Like he's definitely getting picked, and I got picked. And other people didn't have that same. They didn't get picked as easy. I just got picked. So yeah.
Because I like the part where you told the story about when, you know, one of the older brothers made that remark to you about you being gay and they don't allow that in their chapter, and how your line brothers kind of just came around and supported you. So I thought that was I enjoyed that story. I also like that you started off the chapter talking about the Delta probate, because I'm a Delta, so I just had to know that. So yeah.
Yeah, and again, that even that moment is interesting because the person who said it, I'm extremely close with now, and
wow.
I don't talk much about that, and that's why I also like I didn't villainize that person. Like I just chose not to like, because I could like if it was a person that like was still being harmful, I probably would have said a little bit more. But it was easy to villainize the person. It was just like this was the experience. But my experience with that person now is. He's probably one of the, I mean, he probably is the most loyal, like, brother outside of my line brothers that I know, like, to me, in that way. But again, it was like, back then, that was a thing that you did. You shamed gayness.
Right, yeah.
But now people fully understand, like, that's not the totality of who we are or the sum of what our work is. So
that's great to hear.
Yeah.
Cool. I would love to hear a bit about your cousin Hope. There's a really beautiful essay in here called "Losing Hope," and there's let me pull up the little quote that I had from it. You ended that essay by saying, "quote Your story will now live on forever through my words, so that whoever may read them can know they exist because you existed." Can you tell everyone a bit about Hope and the journey that Hope had, and then also your journey with Hope?
Yeah, and it's tough to tell that story, and for multiple reasons, because now I have language, and so like back then I didn't have language. So even when I wrote the book and I wrote the chapter, and let me just preface this by saying Hope was my transgender older cousin who passed away, I believe it was 2011. And so I wrote this story about Hope, and the first time like I remember meeting Hope pre-transition, but the way I wrote it in the book, I wrote it from the space of not having the language. So I wrote it as who I was back then, which it's tough because we're still learning. I think in many ways we're still learning how to write about queer people, with gender being fluid and sexuality being fluid. It's still kind of tough to like if I identified as a gay he him 15 years ago and you're referencing me 15 years ago, are you referencing me using the pronouns I use now? Are you referencing me using the name I used then? Now we have language, right? So now we know like you're not supposed to use a dead name once a trans person deads the name given to them at birth, and they dead that and they choose a name, you know, we're supposed to follow their chosen name. The way I wrote that story was tough though, in a sense, because like I used both names because of the relationship that I had with Hope and we had as a family with Hope, and because of Hope's choice to use her names interchangeably, because back then in 2003, we didn't have we just didn't have all of that, right? We didn't have a politic or a lens, and I wanted people to understand that. And I needed for children to see what the full journey of from my perspective as a person who was queer, watching her journey of transition, what it looked like and what it felt like and how it affirmed me. So the story of Hope, basically, I describe how like that was like the first like person that I saw that gave me any type of representation, at least of how I felt on the inside. And so in the book, I talk about how like in my daydreams, I always daydreamed of myself as a girl because I was so effeminate and sassy. I only thought that I could be a girl. And because my cousin Hope was already in my family and transgender people were in my family, and I, as a child, saw them throughout their transitioning process, in my mind, I thought that, oh, at some point I'm going to transition too. And so that's how that will work for me. And it wasn't until I got older and started seeing more images of what queer people could look like that I realized like, oh, wait a minute, that's not how that works for everyone. And how I had to work through those feelings and those emotions about it. The story of Hope primarily deals with, though, when she decided to change her name and the love that we had for Hope, even though we didn't have the language, and how, if Hope were still alive, how I think the way we would operate with Hope would be much different. And I know Hope would still be like one of my biggest cheerleaders because she was really like a sister in many, many ways with private conversations we got to have as I was growing up. But I just wanted to make sure like that I ensured like that her story was out there, because it's such an unfortunate thing that like we watch what is happening with Black transgender women, and we watch how they're killed and nobody shows up for them. And we watch how their bodies have become disposable in a sense in many, many ways. And for me, it was important to tell that story because we never saw Hope as someone who wasn't our family, and we never saw Hope as somebody who we couldn't invite to the birthday or to the cookout or to the wedding anniversary or to the wedding or to the funeral, right? Like there was none of that from us, but there was a lot of that from society. But I didn't realize that until I was old enough to go out with her myself and see people staring and see people looking, and then I got uncomfortable because I didn't understand how to like protect her in that moment while I was still trying to protect myself. And so that's kind of what that story talks about, and how if things were different and things were now, how I know things would be different and how we would operate now, and Hope would be like championed and celebrated in a way that she should have been back then by community and by society for how great of a person she was.
Thank you for sharing.
As an activist yourself, what's something that you wish more people knew about the role that Black activists play in the LGBTQ plus rights struggles?
I've written about it. I've talked about it. Stonewall is Black history, and I will, I guess, keep working on that until people understand why. I actually am working on a Stonewall graphic novel. That's
exciting.
Yeah, and it's gonna take a lot of work, but I'm working on a Stonewall graphic novel. But at the end of the day, Stonewall is Black history, and Stonewall you can call it a rebellion, you can call it an uprising, or you can call it a riot. Like it was what it was. It was a violent pushback, because it wasn't a protest. It was a violent riot against police brutality. And it was led primarily by Black femmes and trans people, specifically Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Miss Major, and Stormé. And Stormé was a biracial butch who was the one being arrested and fighting the police initially. And when she finally yelled out, like, are y'all going to do anything? Like, after the police were already brutalizing her, it was Black trans women who then decided, yes, we are going to do something, and decided to take on the police that night. And Stonewall is important because it was one of the first times that like the NYPD had lost some type of fight in that way, right? Like for many, many years, the NYPD had been raiding queer bars and doing all of these things to queer people publicly to shame them. The newspapers used to print the pictures when the police would arrest them after the raid. The newspapers would print pictures of people who weren't out to community to out them. There was like a whole system in place to harm queer people. And so Stonewall, at that moment, like that it happened, it was the first time really that queer people decided that they were going to fight back. And it wasn't just one night, it was 5 days of riot, which again led to the reason that we even have LGBTQ rights today. And again, much of that is owed to Marsha P. Johnson, who everyone says, who we say threw the first brick. And, you know, some people want to push back against like, no, and yes. And we know queer history has been destroyed in many ways and not been cataloged in many ways. But what we do know is that on the second night, she definitely dropped a bag of bricks on a cop car. So anybody that radical, like, we have no doubt in our minds that Marsha was one of the main ones who got us to where we are today, and she was a Black trans woman. And it is important that we continue to honor like the legacy of what Black queer people did in that fight, because we get washed out of many, many struggles and movements, like we were the HIV movements. There are a lot of Black queer people who got us to where we are today, who will be overshadowed by, unfortunately, cis white gay men who co-opt a lot of those movement spaces because they still have privilege because of their whiteness. And so a lot of what I do is teaching us how we take back those stories and tell them properly.
So we're in one of these moments right now, of course, as a community, and there. First off, we acknowledge that we believe that Black lives matter and that Black trans lives matter. How do we make sure that the importance of intersectionality, especially with the trans community and the Black Lives Matter movement, remain in the forefront of everyone's consciousness of it? And like, I've even been out and seen the way like the Black Trans Lives Matter gatherings have been shunned by people on their way to the main Black Lives Matter movement. I saw it 2 weeks ago in DC, and it just like it was like a knife going in, and that's with I know that I haven't lived this experience myself, but there is this notion of intersectionality that must be in the forefront, I think, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like we're total beings, right? And like it's either all Black Lives Matter or none of us matter at the end of the day, right? And so it's as intersectional, and it's so interesting because it's like people can understand the intersection of gender as long as it stays on a binary. And so it's like, but even then some people don't understand that, right? And so it's like when you have Black women saying, say her name, you have certain Black men who are upset at that. And it's like that they're saying that because y'all are overlooking what is happening to them in these movements. You're overlooking the fact that they are always on the front line for when a Black man dies. Y'all are overlooking the fact that queer people have always been frontline, and in many ways are the ones who have started the movements. You know, BLM was started by 3 Black and brown queer women. At least the hashtag and like what was birthed out of, you know, Ferguson and Mike Brown. And so again, we've always been at the forefront. At Stonewall, we were there. Like every time you name a moment, we were there, right? Civil rights movement, we were there. We've been at the forefront of every single movement. For some reason, there continues to be this ask of us, like you have to be Black first, like you're Black before you're gay, you're Black before you're trans, you're Black before you're these things. And it's like, well, if that's the case, then when it is one of us, then who loses our life, why is that not the first thing that y'all are saying to yourselves to come and defend me? Why is that not the first thing you're saying to yourselves when we need y'all to march for a lost one of that particular community, right? And it's because you truly don't believe that. What it is that you believe you have the power to tell us that our Blackness has to come before our queerness, when we're telling you our Blackness is inherently queer and that your Blackness has to be inherently queer because you don't exist if I don't exist, and vice versa. And our community encompasses all of these things. And so a lot of the work looks like us teaching how or helping people to unlearn everything that they thought even about themselves, right? Like you're Black and you're cis and your maleness, it doesn't put you in a place to be any better than my Black cis queerness, right? But again, if you're using that as the factor that stops you from protecting me, if you're using that as the factor that stops you from marching for my life, if you're using that as the factor that makes you be violent towards me, then do you really believe that Black people come first? And do you really believe that Black people are the first and most important part of these conversations and these movements? Because to me, you can't believe that and also say that I have to be that before this other thing. If you know what my other thing is, then you are othering my Blackness. And that is something that can no longer continue if we are going to ever find any form of liberation. Like, it really has to move to a place of get over yourself. I don't even know how else to better say it. It's just like, get over yourself, get over your biases. Like, you know, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, many of those things, you know, many of the things that we deal with are a byproduct of misogyny. And so it's like, again, we have literally watched people throw a Black girl in a dumpster yesterday while videotaping. I think we watched a Black girl get hit in the head with a skateboard yesterday. Like, you know, we watched the world make an unwilling martyr of George Floyd, in a sense, and not forget, but like remember like Breonna, and remember like Rekia Boyd, and remember like Nina Pop, and remember like there are so many other. We just lost 2 trans women over the last 3 days, 3 trans women over the last 3 days. It's like, who were Black, right? It's like, you have to show up for them too. If you're not showing up for them, then you're disposing them the same way white people dispose you.
Yeah, like I saw something online the other day. This girl made this tweet that said something like, we went from Black Lives Matter to all Black Lives Matter. And I'm just like, what's the difference? Like, it's literally like, you're not getting the point. Like, why are you even, yeah.
Well, I mean, right, but I think that is the point, right? Because you thought that there was some Black lives that didn't matter.
Yeah.
And
she had a problem with people saying that. I'm like, no, because the emphasis needs to be there because of people like you who are saying things like that.
Right. And I mean, Angela Davis, you know, she's been doing a lot of talking about like abolition and defunding and like helping a lot of people understand. And like, you know, she even had to say like, you know, I'm not in unity with all Black people. And when she says that, it's like, I can't be in unity with my oppressor. Like, if you come into this with like these oppressive tactics, even if you are Black and we share that thread of Blackness, like, you can't continue to do the type of harm that you do to me and have the expectation of me to teach you out of that harm that you are doing to me. It's like, stop the harm and then maybe we will teach, but I'm not going to teach you while you are still hitting me. And so I think that's kind of where we started to have to get with this. Is like, listen, your request for time to not be homophobic, your request for time to learn to not be transphobic, your request for time to learn to not be misogynistic, a lot of people die while they wait for you to get to this place. And now, can you get there at 30, or are we talking about it's going to take you till you're 40, or is it going to take you till you're 50? Because in those amount of years that it's taking y'all to learn these things and to unlearn these things, people are dying. And so the dying, like that, it just has to stop. Like the harming of people that are your own has to be immediate. And then you need to start to read feminist works and Google and research and talk to people who are your peers and really, really learn what Black communities look
like. And along those lines, what would you have to say to, I'm going to call my own self out here, the cis white gay men who need to stop resting on the laurels of the marriage victory and whatever happened in SCOTUS this week, and wake up and show up, because it's about human rights. And if folks get complacent with whatever their momentary victories are, that doesn't hold. As we're seeing in the immigrant community, for example, things do not hold for a long time, and it's really important to kind of stay aware of it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like cis white gay men are in many ways much more harmful than, in many ways can be much more harmful than straight white men. And that's honestly because they actually have a piece of oppression that they can wield as power in many ways and in many spaces that we can't do. And so they can use the fact that they are queer as a way to gain things in a way that we cannot use that. But they're also white, so they already have a lot of power in spaces, and then they can use their queerness to gain additional power in many ways that many of us cannot use. The unfortunate thing is that oftentimes when we deal with white gays and just white queer people in general, there's this fetishization factor that happens over the Black queer body. And so like, we are fetishized for our body parts, and we are fetishized in many ways for our aesthetic and for how we look, and just like all of these different terms that are used, like I don't want to get too graphic on here, so but there are just like a lot of keywords and terms that are used that are very, very demeaning, because it literally reduces Black queer people to their body parts. And then like when we have like these issues around like pride, like when we wanted to add like a brown stripe or a black stripe, you had a whole bunch of white queer people that were upset about that. And it's like, okay, so what is it, right? It's like, simply because we share an oppression doesn't mean that racism left. Simply because we share an oppression doesn't mean that anti-Blackness left. And it's not okay for you to just be a white that's not racist. Like, you have to be an anti-racist, which means you have to actually do actionable items that show that you understand your power, you understand that you have some privileges that I don't, and that you're willing to use that power to protect the community that needs it the most. I say it all the time. Like, while white queer people were fighting for marriage equality, Black queer people were fighting the police. While white queer people were fighting for marriage equality, Black queer people were fighting the HIV epidemic still. Like, we are literally still fighting a whole litany of other things that white queer people in many ways just seem to just like not be invested in, even though we share the same safe spaces, right? And so I think the charge then has to be on white queer people to do better, and to, again, make sure like you are using make sure like, and to do better, one, and two, to not co-opt off of like the creation of a space that was created by a Black queer person. Stonewall, a space created by Black queer people and like the movement and all this, it became co-opted, and we see where that led, right? We're having the Stonewall 50th anniversary, and y'all are trying to kick trans women out of the Stonewall, right? Like, you know, like things like that, right? I often talk about this too because of the book. I talk about Moonlight in the book because Moonlight was really important, because I felt like Moonlight was a movie that kind of got you to, it didn't get you to that place of Black queerness in a sense, but it did get you to that place of Black masculinity, Black male vulnerability. And in many ways, it touched on the aspect of like Black men struggling with that identity crisis of trying to be masculine, but also being attracted to a man, and all of those things. But I always say it was like, it felt like Moonlight happened, won this Oscar, was gonna open the floodgates for us, and in a weird way, it ended up greenlighting a lot of white queer movies and a lot of white queer books and a lot of white queer storytelling. And so then you had like Love, Simon, and you had like, it just seems like book after book and movie after movie around like these weird white queer romances and boyfriends and relationships, and it just started happening primarily after Moonlight. And it was like, how did that, like, but we still didn't get anything, like, right? And so like now I have a book out, and I think it'll be interesting to see what now white queer memoir possibly blooms from this. And if no more Black queer memoirs bloom, young adult specifically, memoirs can bloom from this, because I don't tell all of our story. So I would love to see stories about someone who dealt with colorism, someone who dealt with fat phobia, someone who dealt with, would go into that YA queer space and do that, right? Because those are a lot of different intersections that I don't have myself. But I feel like I'm going to have to fight for those stories to get out there, where I feel like people will use my book as a comp for some white queer author or white queer show to get the green light for their story, because they feel their story isn't being told, even though their story has been told more times than once.
Yeah. Howard, do you have a last question before we go to the audience?
I do. So I was really excited when I saw that you posted that you and Gabrielle Union are going to be turning your book into a series. So is there anything that you can tell us about that, or how did you guys like collaborate, and how did she become a part of this?
Yeah, so back over a year ago, I wrote an article about Dwayne, Gabby, and Zaya, and just like how that's how a Black family is supposed to operate when a child comes out as queer. At the time, Zaya was identifying as queer, and I wrote the story, and they both saw it, and they both read it, and they both sent me these really, really nice messages about the story, because it was one of the first stories that was written about it. Like, everybody else just kind of was like, oh, okay, like, we're not touching it. But I was like, well, somebody got to write about it, and I wrote about it. From there, like, our relationship kind of like started to grow, where we could like DM each other and talk to each other just around like a lot of different topics. And so when the advanced reader copies of the book came out, I was like, oh, well, let me see, like, I'm gonna take a shot and see if maybe she'll want it, right? Sent it, and she loved it. And so from there, it just kind of blossomed into this like, like, well, what can we do with this? And like, what can we turn this into? Because I think this is the story that needs to get out there. And so we're still in discussions around like which part of my life it will focus on. So it's like, I don't want to give too much away. It'll definitely be a little, I'll say, closer to like the older part, and like using the stories as like the background and kind of like the meat and potatoes that kind of like help build up to who that person became. But yeah, that's how that relationship began. And it's funny because there are a lot of people happy for it, but there are also some people that are upset. And I see the upset comments. I don't let them bother me, because like I can't worry about like the people who are upset about me telling a true story. Because again, if you feel that we can't tell true stories, then you're no better than a white person that says we shouldn't be telling Black stories about you, right? Like, if you think that my story isn't important, but these are the same people that are probably saying Black Lives Matter. And so I think that it all kind of feeds and goes hand in hand, because in one breath it's like Black Lives Matter, and it's like, oh, wait, that's too much Black life, right? And it's like, well, no, unfortunately, you're going to also learn about my Black life. And if you don't want to learn about it, then change the channel. But all of our stories need to be told. And so I'm very, very fortunate that I have someone like Gabrielle who is willing to go that extra mile to make sure that this story gets told. And I know it's going to be told properly, because she's someone who advocates and really, really cares about us, and really, really pushes for more people in community to care about our stories being told. And it gets to be told by us, which is also something that's rare. So
awesome. So we're going to switch over to audience questions now. If you have a question and haven't asked it already, please go ahead and type it into whatever comment or chat box you're viewing the program through, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. The first question that we've got is from Malia, who says, first, I want to say I loved, all caps, your book. And as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community and as a young Black woman, thank you for your transparency. We know what the inspiration was to write it, but how long did it take for you to just say, F it, I'm writing this?
I think I originally decided I wanted to write a book in 2017. Yeah, I was like, okay, I want to write a book. And I wasn't sure what the book was going to be, but I was like, I want to write a book. And I know I've been telling my story in pieces for a long time. But I will say it took from August of 2017 until January 23rd of 2018, when I finally was like, F it, I'm gonna write the query letter. And I wrote the query letter, sent the query letter in about what I wanted to write about. The agent, Eric Smith, emailed me back like the next day and was like, oh my God, I love this, send me the proposal. And I had not written the proposal. And so I then spent the next 3 days writing a proposal, like nonstop, and getting it into him. And then I was signed that next week. And then 2 months later, I signed a book deal.
Awesome. Very cool. The next question is from, forgive the pronunciation, Aishen or Aishen, Aiysshen. Sorry for butchering your name. The question is, what would you tell your younger self today? Something you wish you knew or could have done different?
I get this question all the time, and I don't know if the answer stay the same or if it changes. But I think the one thing that I always say is like, if I could tell my younger self something, it would be like that you're going to like turn out to be a really, really amazing person if you just continue to believe in the truth that you know who you are, even if everybody else keeps trying to tell you that you're not that thing. And to stop telling yourself you're not that thing, and to lean into the fact that you are the things that you think that you are, and it's going to work out for you in the end.
Cool.
So Dawn asks, Mr. Johnson, how did you come up with the title of your book?
That's a good question. So that wasn't the original title of the book. The original title of the book was called Smile, Black Boy Smile. And I love that title, but it wasn't hitting right with everybody. And like when you go into publishing, like you'll learn like there are a lot of people that have to agree on certain things. And so on that one thing, it was like, well, can we kind of come up with something different? And so I sat down and was like, all right, like what would be really, really good title? And I started thinking about like all the things that I was inspired by to write the book and like what really pushed me to write the book. And so I came up with All Boys Aren't Blue. And it pays homage to Moonlight. Moonlight, before it was Moonlight, it was a play. It was Black Boys Look Blue in Moonlight, was the play by Terrell Alvin McCraney. And I've always been inspired by Terrell. I think Terrell is one of our greatest storytellers and going to be go down in history as one of our greatest storytellers of Black stories. And Terrell's works are just like super inspiring, as is Terrell as a person. And so I wanted to make sure that there was some type of homage paid to that, because Moonlight it affected me in many, many ways that I hadn't addressed in my own childhood. My dad was a cop, so I grew up in technically what is called a blue family, which is so interesting, I guess, now because I'm so anti-police and defund and abolish and all of that. So we have very interesting conversations at home, but it all works out because my dad gets it. And he's not a cop anymore, so it makes it even easier. But that was the nod to the fact that we grew up in a blue family, and we were around the law and order. My dad could be strict at times, very matter of fact, very about the law and all of those things. The third blue is a character from the show Queen Sugar. There was a little boy named Blue, and his father, Ralph Angel, Blue had a doll. And so his father, Ralph Angel, used to let him play with the doll. But as Blue started to get older and still have the doll, then his aunts and people started to question what was really going on with Blue and Blue's sexuality. And Ralph Angel, I thought it was amazing because Ralph Angel protected Blue at all costs, and did not care what people thought and let Blue play with the doll. And the fourth blue is clearly a pushback against the gender reveal situation. And so it's if my parents did a gender reveal back then and it was a bunch of blue balloons, it would have been surprise, 35 years later, clearly I'm not blue. I'm a little more pink than blue, I guess you would say. And if you read the story in the book, you could tell that my parents actually didn't want to know what I was. And I think more parents need to go back to that. So, yeah.
Sasha asks, what books influenced you when you were a child?
That's a good question. I'm what? I don't even, the books, I guess the books they forced us to read, I don't know. No, I think we read, I do remember we read the three Negro classics. I had to read a children's version of an autobiography of Malcolm X, which was really, really inspiring for me. I think it was in the 3rd or 4th grade. They had a children's version of his story, which was really, really great. Books didn't really inspire me because we were stuck on reading Ralph Ellison and The Invisible Man and Tennessee Williams and The Glass Menagerie and Catcher in the Rye and Little Women, and our reading list literally were about a bunch of blah 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 white people. So it's to be inspired by a book back then, it wasn't going to happen. I will say when I got to college, I have a professor, Professor Murray, who I still talk with. She made us read a book called The Four Agreements. And I think it's one of the greatest books out there because every time you read it, it has a different meaning. And I think that's the amazing thing about that book because it's based off of where you at in life when you're reading it in that moment. So
cool. Thank you. Yeah. Next up is a question from Debbie, who asks, how did the book cover get created and did you have any input? It's a beautiful cover.
Thank you. I know, right? I feel I'm did we even hold the book up? So people can see that's the book cover. The book cover creation, yes, I had a lot of input. I'm a Scorpio, so I'm very Yeah, I'm a Scorpio, so it's like very perfectionist, very like what I don't like very early on. And so like very early on, I was like, I asked the question like, well, do the authors get a say in the book cover? And they were like, typically they don't. We have a team that reads the book and they come with these ideas. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't know if that's gonna work for me. Like, I'll be 100% honest. Like, I have my own ideas, and so it was a collaborative effort at the end of the day. But I wanted like specific things. The artist that drew my portrait is Charlie Palmer, who's world renowned, very well known in Atlanta. And the crown of flowers was like a thing that I like when they sent me the image, like one of the early like mock-ups had like this beautiful black boy with like these flowers and like his thing was flowers. And I was like, okay, I want that, but I was like, the flowers have to be very specific. And so the yellow rose is my fraternity flower. And so the front flower is called a bird of paradise, which is my mom's favorite flower. And then the middle flower is the poinsettia, which is a flower that you usually see around Christmas, especially in Black churches, that signifies my grandmother, because that was definitely one of her like favorite flowers. And I could just remember Christmas time, like us having to take these poinsettias home for her from the church.
Cool.
So Sheila asks, if you had written the book earlier, like 2 to 3 years prior, how would it have been different and how?
It would have been different simply because I wasn't even living in New York yet. And so my lived experience would have been different. Furthermore, my grandmother didn't get sick until 2000. She got sick after I turned in the first draft. And so there are parts of the book that I entirely rewrote because I knew she wasn't going to be alive when the book came out. And so because of that, I had to rewrite a lot of things, and it changed my process on how I was going to write a lot of things. I think had I known she was still going to be alive, there would have been many, many ways that the book would have been different.
Oh, I got to unmute. Oh, I'm unmuted. Great. Last question that we've got before we need to start to wrap up here is from, let's see who it's from. Anyway, I'll just start reading it. When it comes to representation and helping BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color, queer, BIPOC, and all of the intersections, what do you think is the most important way to support children? You talk about not seeing yourself represented in media, books, movies, etc., and that seems really important. So does educating families so that they can be supportive? Do those two things go hand in hand, or are all the mechanisms of support unique and somewhat isolated?
I think I think everything is going to be unique. I really, really do. And I say that because like there's no two queer people that are exactly alike. There are no two family environments that are exactly alike. And so I think when I think of, I guess the best example I can use is this. Like when people ask me like about my spirituality, like I tell them what I do, but I tell them, listen, as a queer person, you need to create whatever the best spirituality setup is for you. Like there is no blueprint of what your spirituality, religion, XYZ looks like as a queer person, because oftentimes many of the texts, many of the doctrines, or people that are interpreting those texts are interpreting them in a way that is harmful towards your being. So what I do is I have a tarot done every month, right? I have an altar set up that I pray to. I sage once a week. Like I do these things because that, for me as a queer person, is how I connect my spirituality. I say to use that kind of idea and take that into when you're having these conversations with different types of queer people or queer children who need information and need resources, right? You need to create whatever the best, safest explanation and education guide is for that particular individual. I think there are going to be many things that overlap. And I think there are many ways that you can use information interchangeably, but I also do think that the experience of a Black queer person is definitely not the experience of of an Indigenous queer person, right? And so there needs to be, yes, these things can all be the same, but there also needs to be specificity in the things that are not. And so that's why I hate the blanket statement. It gets better because it does not get better for all of us. Like it sometimes gets worse, or you know what I mean? And so it's like, but I think that kind of is the best way I can explain it, right? Like that's cute that it may get better for these people, but for us, it doesn't get better unless A, B, C, D happens, right? And for this person, it doesn't get better if A through G doesn't happen. And for this person, it might get better if A and B happen. And so it's like you have to kind of teach it in that way with specificity for whatever the situation is for whomever the child is.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So before we do our closing, how can people follow you on social, George?
You can follow me on Twitter at IamGMJohnson. You can also follow me on Instagram at IamGMJohnson. I use my Facebook sometimes, so you can also follow me there at George Matthew Johnson. And yeah, I think those are the main websites I use. And I also have the website, IamGMJohnson.com. I think you can subscribe. I'm pretty sure you can subscribe there for any updates. And yeah, you might just see some more press releases soon. So. Oh,
awesome. Well, we're gonna be ready for that. Before we wrap, first of all, thank you to everyone who's tuned in. We have special appreciation to our colleagues at Anne Arundel County Public Library, Calvert Library, Carroll County Public Library, Enoch Pratt Free Library, and Howard County Public Library. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate all of our colleagues at those libraries. When we work together, we make sure that stories like George's get out to as many people as possible. And that is what we're all about in libraries. We need to make the information and the experiences available to as many people as possible so that we can all learn, especially those of us who have some catching up to do in terms of what our brothers and sisters and siblings have been experiencing in this country. So 2 quick things. PGCMLS is doing Pride events till the end of the month. You can visit our Pride page at pgcmls.info/pride for lots of information. The other thing is that we're celebrating Juneteenth all week. Juneteenth, if you don't know what it is, you need to find out, and you need to do it this week because you're going to be way behind, even more than you might have been before this week. So go to our website, pgcmls.info/Juneteenth, learn all about it. It should be a national holiday. It is for many people, and it needs to just be recognized in that way by more people going forward. It is a fundamental part of our history and acknowledges the kind of discrepancies in even learning about the end of slavery in this country and people who were left in slavery far beyond when they needed to down south. So learn about Juneteenth. If you have not purchased a copy of George's book, please do so, and please support Black-owned bookstores. Great indies here in our area are Loyalty Books, based in Silver Spring and DC, also Mahogany Books, based in Southeast DC, both fabulous organizations. So check them out. If your library does not own a copy of these books yet, you can tell them to buy a copy. That is part of your role as a citizen. It is our job to collect books that you need and want. So we've already got it here in Prince George's County, but out there, you know, if you've got relatives in other parts of the country and they don't have access to this book yet through their library, please encourage them to request it. The best way that we can all support George's work is by buying the book if we have the means. And if we have the means to buy it for more people, buy it and gift it out, because that is what's going to really make the difference, one person at a time, as we deal with bettering our world, because the world needs a lot of help right now, and it's needed it for a long time. So I will get off my soapbox and invite Howa to give us a closing question for George, and then we will wrap up and let George go have dinner or have a cocktail or whatever he'd like.
Ooh, a closing question. What advice do you have for teens who are beginning to discover their own identity and may be concerned with their loved ones' reactions because of religious or cultural beliefs?
Okay.
So, a heavy one at the end.
I'm sorry.
I'm ready. So first of all, you are not coming out. Like, we are taking away like that whole term. Like, one of the things that I'm grateful for is that I have a bigger platform that is growing, so that when it is time, I can really fight to push like the ending of coming out. I think coming out is dangerous. I think it's dangerous rhetoric. I think it's absolutely absurd for you to already tell me that I don't exist in your community and that I have to come out to you because I owe you that when I really don't. And so I want queer children to take the advice of, you are not coming out. What you are actually doing is inviting in. You are inviting people into your truth. You are inviting people into your space. You are the person with the agency. You are the person with the power in that moment. And you are giving people the privilege and the honor to know exactly who you are. So you are actually inviting people into that. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who gets invited in will get to stay in. Mm-hmm. So some of the people you are going to have to kick out. And if people want to reject you and do all those things and be harmful to you, that is not okay. But what is okay, for you to do is to find a community that will love and will cherish you and will respect you. And so if you can't find that in your parents, then maybe you can find that in your aunt, and maybe you can find that in your uncle, or maybe you can find it in a cousin, or maybe you can find it in a friend whose parents will accept you. But trust, there are people out here who really do love and affirm LGBTQ people. There are people out here who don't see their children as disposable, or don't see Black queer children or queer children overall as disposable. And so I encourage you to start to build that community. And I encourage you to start to use your voice and tell older queer people what it is that you need. And we need more GSAs in high school, because we need places where there are alliances, and we need places where queer kids can connect with other queer kids and build their own communities and build their own friendships and build their own systems of safety and build their own systems of society amongst everyone else, but also sometimes separate from everyone else, because we deal with a separate set of issues. And so at the end of the day, just remember, you have the agency. You are owed no one a coming out, and you get to decide when you want to invite people into your life.
Awesome. Well, thank you, George, for challenging us to improve how we discuss ability to support folks as they're continuing on in their journeys. That's really powerful. And I hope we all can adopt and honor George by living that language and that way of communicating. Thank you, George. Thank you, Hawa. Thank you, Macmillan. Thank you all for joining us. This has been really wonderful. Happy Pride. And please remember that Pride is an opportunity for all of us to come together to better our communities and to support our Black neighbors, and also our Black trans neighbors and our Black queer neighbors. And together we will somehow make some improvement, because we have to, because this is not going to last. We can't keep going in the way that we've been going. And we all have a role to play in educating ourselves, hearing the stories and voices that have been among us this whole time, but haven't been given the time of day to be heard. And let's make sure that this moment that we're living as a country and as a community is not just a moment, but rather a new status quo that is one that we can be proud of going forward. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.